There was a time when Steam was filled with dark worlds, endless dungeon runs, impossible loot grinds, and entire communities obsessed with finding the next legendary drop. Some of these games wanted to become the next Diablo. Some tried to reinvent the formula completely, and others quietly built cult followings before disappearing almost without anyone noticing. Today, we're talking about 17 isometric action RPGs and MMOARPGs that all share one thing in common. They were delisted from Steam. Some were shut down because of financial collapse. Others vanished because of publisher scandals, legal issues, abandoned servers, or disastrous management decisions. And in some cases, the games technically still exist, but only through fan projects desperately trying to preserve them. This is the story of ARPGs Steam left behind. We begin with one of the most visually striking games on this entire list, Akaneiro, Demon Hunters. Released in 2013 by Spicy Horse, the studio founded by American McGee, the game transformed the story of Little Red Riding Hood into a dark Japanese fantasy filled with yokai, demons, and cursed forests, inspired by Edo-era mythology. Visually, it stood out immediately. The hand-painted art style looked like moving ink paintings, something halfway between traditional Japanese woodblock art and a dark fantasy comic. Underneath that atmosphere was a familiar ARPG structure: hack-and-slash combat, loot grinding, skill trees, and character specialization through disciplines like prowess, fortitude, and cunning. But eventually, the game began collapsing from the inside. By 2022, Akaneiro was effectively broken because of dead servers and missing back-end infrastructure. According to reports, American McGee himself contacted Steam and requested the game's removal so new players wouldn't unknowingly install a non-functional product. And somehow, that created another bizarre moment. Steam accidentally delisted almost the entire Spicy Horse catalog in the process. What makes the story even sadder is that parts of the game's original server-side source code were reportedly lost after the studio shut down, meaning the original creators themselves couldn't fully restore it anymore. Today, fan projects and experimental workarounds still exist, but Akaneiro survives only as a shadow of what it once was. A haunting start to this list. Some games die because of technical failure. Others die because of scandal. Originally launched as Wild Buster Heroes of Titan, this sci-fi MMOARPG mixed Diablo-style combat with MOBA-inspired heroes, faction warfare, PvP battlegrounds, raids, and over 20 playable characters. It actually had ambition. But only months after launch, Valve permanently banned it from Steam. Why? Because the publisher, Incel Games, became involved in one of the most infamous review manipulation controversies on the platform. According to leaked reports, employees were allegedly pressured into buying the game and posting positive Steam reviews under threat of losing their jobs. Valve responded immediately by removing not only Wild Buster, but multiple Incel Games titles from Steam entirely. The developers later attempted a comeback by relaunching the game under a new name, Champions of Titan. But the damage was already done. The player base never recovered, and by 2020, the servers shut down permanently. No private servers, no revival projects, no second chance. Just another MMO erased from the platform. Then we arrive at one of the most tragic examples of always online DRM destroying a game. Darkspore, released by EA and developed by Maxis in 2011, Darkspore combined Diablo-style gameplay with creature customization inspired by Spore. On paper, it sounded incredible. Players collected genetic heroes, customized abilities, and fought through sci-fi environments filled with procedural enemies and loot systems. But Darkspore made one fatal mistake. It required a permanent online connection, even for single player. As the player base declined, server support slowly deteriorated. Login errors became common. Bugs remained unfixed. Entire sections of the game stopped functioning properly, and eventually EA shut the servers down completely. The result? The entire game died with them. Today, fan restoration projects like Resurrection Capsule are attempting to rebuild the experience from scratch. Players can partially explore maps and experiment with customization again, but the game remains largely broken. Darkspore became a warning sign for the entire industry. A game people legally purchased became unplayable forever because authentication servers disappeared. Devilian is another example of a game sacrificed for something bigger. Released in 2015 by Bluehole and published by Trion Worlds, Devilian blended MMOARPG systems with fast-paced isometric combat inspired by Diablo and Path of Exile. Its defining mechanic was the Devilian form, allowing players to transform into powerful demonic versions of themselves with separate progression trees and abilities. For a while, the game had momentum, but then PUBG exploded in popularity. Bluehole shifted resources toward PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and Devilian rapidly lost support. Updates slowed down. Technical issues remained unfixed. Player numbers dropped, and by 2018, the game shut down permanently. Unlike other MMOs on this list, no fan revival scene ever emerged. Devilian simply disappeared. Emberheart represents a very different type of delisting, the unfinished indie project struggling to survive. The game focused on classic ARPG systems, isometric combat, loot hunting, character builds, and dark fantasy exploration. It aimed to capture the feeling of older-school dungeon crawlers while adding modern endgame systems and deeper progression mechanics. But in 2024, the developers suddenly removed the game from Steam. The official explanation referenced legal complications and personal development struggles behind the scenes. Unlike many titles here, however, Emberheart is not officially dead. The developers insist the project is still alive internally and may eventually return after major restructuring. For existing owners, the game remains playable, which places Emberheart in a strange category. Not fully alive, but not entirely gone either. Few games on this list had a development history as chaotic as Fractured Online. This sandbox MMORPG promised a player-driven world with classless progression systems, survival mechanics, and isometric action combat. But publisher conflicts quickly destabilized the project. In 2023, the game vanished from Steam after a major split between the developers and publisher Gamigo. Months later, it returned. Then in 2025, the original version shut down again entirely after the IP changed hands once more. But unlike many dead MMORPGs, Fractured still has a future. The game is currently being rebuilt under a new title, Fractured Conquest. Whether that relaunch succeeds remains uncertain. But Fractured's story perfectly represents how unstable live service development has become. Then there's Guardians of Ember, another casualty of Steam review manipulation scandals. The game combined Diablo-like dungeon crawling with MMORPG systems, dual-class progression, randomized dungeons, PvP arenas, and player housing. It wasn't revolutionary, but it had its audience. Then Valve discovered that the publisher, Incel Games, had been artificially inflating Steam reviews using employee accounts. The result? An immediate delisting in 2018. The game later returned briefly under Gameforge as a free-to-play title outside Steam, but licensing agreements eventually expired and the server shut down permanently in 2020. Today, Guardians of Ember is completely inaccessible. No servers, no offline mode, no preservation. Gone. Exilium feels almost forgotten compared to the bigger games on this list. An indie isometric ARPG focused more on exploration and atmosphere than pure combat speed. The game followed an exiled king uncovering the mysteries behind his banishment. Its slower pacing made it stand apart from more chaotic loot grinders. But eventually, development stopped completely. No major updates arrived. Technical issues remained unresolved. And quietly, the game disappeared from Steam. Unlike massive MMOs, in Exilium didn't die dramatically. It simply faded away. And honestly, that might be even sadder. Released back in 2007, Legend, Hand of God, belonged to a generation of ARPGs desperately trying to follow the success of Diablo 2. The game featured hybrid class systems, randomized dungeons, cinematic combat, and one particularly strange mechanic, a glowing fairy companion named Luna that acted as both your cursor and your in-game guide. It had ambition, but time was not kind to it. After publisher insolvency, outdated middleware issues, and growing compatibility problems with modern operating systems, the game was eventually delisted from Steam in 2018. Ironically, the game still survives today, mostly through abandonware communities and fan patches keeping old PC games alive. Without those communities, titles like this would completely vanish. Lindwyrm mixed roguelite dungeon, crawling with town rebuilding systems, inspired by European folklore and Gothic fantasy. The developers described it as battle, build, and brain tease. Combat focused on fast action gameplay, while dungeons included platforming traps, environmental puzzles, and co-op multiplayer. But despite positive ideas, the studio eventually admitted the game failed financially. Development stopped before version 1 ever happened. The Steam version disappeared in 2025. Interestingly, the game still survives on Epic Game Store, making it one of the few entries here delisted specifically from Steam rather than erased completely. And then we reach, perhaps, the strangest story on this entire list. Malus. A dark, slow-paced ARPG inspired by Diablo and Dark Souls, Malus emphasized tactical combat, oppressive darkness, and immersive dungeon crawling. The atmosphere was genuinely intriguing. But behind the scenes, development became increasingly unstable. Long periods of silence followed promises of major updates. Then came legal trademark disputes involving the game's name. Then attempted rebrands. And then something almost unbelievable happened. Shortly before the game disappeared, an update reportedly replaced the game's files with empty 0 kilobytes data, effectively deleting the game from owners' systems. People accused the developer of sabotaging the project before abandoning it entirely. Today, recovering old versions requires extremely technical methods involving Steam depots or unofficial archives. Malus didn't just die, it almost erased itself. If there's one game people still passionately mourn, it's probably Marvel Heroes Omega. For years, this was the superhero ARPG dream. Diablo-style gameplay mixed with Marvel characters, massive loot systems, raids, costumes, and over 60 playable heroes. Spider-Man, Iron Man, Wolverine, Doctor Strange. The game had flaws, but it also had genuine heart. Then everything collapsed, player numbers dropped, financial problems surfaced, reports of internal misconduct emerged, and finally Disney terminated Gazillion's Marvel license entirely. Once that happened, the game's fate was sealed. Servers shut down in November 2017. Gazillion collapsed shortly afterward. But unlike many games here, Marvel Heroes refused to stay dead. Private server communities eventually rebuilt large portions of the game through projects like Project Tahiti and Council of Ancients. And today, against all odds, people are playing Marvel Heroes again. MU Legend tried to modernize one of the oldest MMOARPG franchises in gaming history, MU Online. Built on Unreal Engine 3, it focused heavily on flashy area of effect combat, dungeon grinding, PvP battles, and large-scale guild warfare. But despite the recognizable name, the game struggled with botting problems, weak management, repetitive grinding, and long periods without meaningful updates. Eventually, Webzen shut down the Steam version in 2023 during a publisher transition to Valve. But unlike many entries on this list, MU Legend survived the transition. Today, It continues operating under the title MU Legend Evo through external launchers outside Steam, which makes it one of the few games here that escaped extinction. Pagan Online eventually transformed into Pagan Absent Gods after the developers abandoned its multiplayer structure. And honestly, that decision may have saved the game for years. Inspired by Slavic mythology, Pagan experimented with WASD movement, highly mobile combat, and hero-based progression systems unusual for traditional ARPGs. But multiplayer maintenance costs became unsustainable, so the game pivoted entirely into a single-player experience. Years later, the developers openly admitted they no longer felt the product met their standards. Instead of endlessly selling a game they considered unfinished, they chose to remove it from Steam. Surprisingly respectable. Or maybe not. Seraph, In the Darkness may be the most controversial game on this list. At first glance, it looked like another dark fantasy Diablo-inspired ARPG, but underneath the combat and loot systems was something Steam strongly dislikes: NFTs and blockchain integration. The game included cryptocurrency economies, NFT equipment, digital asset trading, and play-to-earn systems tied to external wallets. That immediately placed it in dangerous territory regarding Steam policy. And in 2025, the game vanished from the platform. Officially, the developers referenced server restructuring and seasonal resets. But many players believe the blockchain integration played a major role in Valve's decision. What makes Seraph unusual is that it still exists outside Steam through standalone launchers and mobile platforms, meaning the game itself survived, just not on Valve's storefront. Released in 2008 by Gas-Powered Games, Space Siege attempted to become the sci-fi successor to Dungeon Siege. The game followed humanity's last survivors aboard a giant colony ship fleeing Earth's destruction. Its most interesting mechanic involved cybernetic upgrades. The more machine parts you installed into your character, the stronger you became, but the less human you remained. It was an interesting concept buried inside a fairly average ARPG. Unfortunately, technical problems slowly destroyed the game's accessibility. Broken DRM systems, compatibility issues, missing support, and abandoned infrastructure eventually led to its Steam delisting in 2017. Today, the game survives mostly through fan fixes and abandonware preservation. Another title saved more by communities than publishers. And finally, we end with Superfuse, one of the newest casualties on this list. At first, the game looked incredibly promising. Comic book visuals, deep skill customization, co-op gameplay, and a dark superhero sci-fi setting often described as Diablo meets the boys. Its standout mechanic, the Fuse system, allowed players to radically modify abilities in creative ways. But after launch, major multiplayer issues and negative reviews damaged momentum immediately. Then financial problems hit, then bankruptcy, then silence. By October 2025, Superfuse disappeared from Steam entirely. And today, while owners can still technically play offline, the online future the game was built around no longer exists. And after looking through all 17 of these games, one thing becomes painfully clear. Modern games are fragile, especially online action RPGs. These are games designed around endless progression, collecting loot, building characters, grinding dungeons, farming rare drops for hundreds of hours. But increasingly, we don't truly own them. We rent access to them. The moment servers disappear, publishers collapse, licenses expire, or developers move on. Entire worlds can vanish overnight. Some of the games on this list survived through private servers and fan communities. Others became abandonware, and some are simply gone forever. What makes this especially sad is that many weren't even terrible games. Some were ambitious failures, Some were victims of timing. Some were destroyed by greed or bad management. But all of them mattered to someone. Somewhere out there, there's still a player who remembers farming loot in Marvel Heroes. Someone who still misses Devilian. Someone who still wants Darkspore to work again. And maybe that's why preservation matters. Because games don't just disappear when servers shut down. They disappear when nobody remembers them anymore. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.